So, shall we start? Good evening, everybody. My name is Christoph Vavrik. I'm a member of the Austrian Parliament. I'm the foreign policy speaker of NEOS, das nach Österreich. That's a small opposition party that I helped to found 2.5 years ago and then entered Parliament in October of last year, no, in October of 2013. And the parliamentary group of NEOS, in cooperation with the Diplomatic Academy, has initiated those NEOS foreign policy talks. Therefore, let me start by offering my special thanks to the Diplomatic Academy and for its director, who is not here yet, Ambassador Winkler, for hosting us tonight and having helped to set up this event. Now, why those foreign policy talks? Almost 3 decades ago, I myself joined the Austrian Foreign Service. Now, I chose to leave it soon thereafter to pursue a career in the private sector, but I never forgot my passion for foreign affairs. So when I came back to Austria in 2009, after 17 years abroad, I was a little bit disappointed about the Austrian mindset regarding foreign affairs. Despite the fact that I think Austria has benefited most from all European countries from the EU enlargement, and despite the fact that we host many international organizations, foremost among them the United Nations, and despite the fact that we have a long tradition of diplomacy, I felt that somehow we had lost interest in what happens around us in Austria. We prefer watching from the sidelines rather than playing on the field. And when it comes to events such as the Arab Spring, the Euro crisis, international trade agreements, or now the Ukrainian-Russian crisis, it looks like to me we prefer to be left alone doing our own business rather than engaging. And when I say doing business, I mean it literally. Rather doing business than maybe engaging in other matters of law, of human rights, of principles. And changing this mindset and creating a more vibrant discourse on foreign policy is the idea behind the initiation of those NEOS foreign policy talks. It's a series of public discussions with diplomats, politicians, journalists, but also experts from business or from civil society that are meant to talk about important international events. As you know, the topic of tonight is the Ukraine-Konflikt between appeasement and containment. The ongoing conflict between the Ukraine on the one hand and the Russian-backed separatists on the other hand has caused a very deep crisis of confidence between Russia on the one hand and the rest of Europe on the other hand, the worst since the end of the Cold War. And after the second Minsk agreement that was signed beginning of this month, there was hope that this was the first step to a lasting peace. It looks, however, that the current ceasefire is very fragile and nobody knows whether it will actually bring peace. So the question is, what could restore peace in the Ukraine? What could restore trust between Russia and the rest of the EU? Is this even a realistic prospect? Is there hope for such a return to a situation of trust? Or should we brace for a prolonged period of hostile defiance, if not conflict, between Russia and the West? A sort of Cold War 2.0. As the West is hesitating between a policy of containment or a policy of appeasement, what should the European Union do? What can Austria contribute? And what's the point of view of the Ukraine? So I'm very happy that tonight we have a very distinguished guest to discuss those matters. For the next 1.5 hours, there will be 45 minutes, I think, panel discussion, and then 45 minutes discussion with you, questions maybe from the audience, and thereafter you're all invited to drinks and finger foods in the room next door. First, let me introduce maybe our moderator, Mr. Christoph Zotter will moderate this evening. Mr. Zotter has studied journalism in Vienna, Vancouver, and Helsinki, and he's one of the editors of Neue Zürcher Zeitung.at. Neue Zürcher Zeitung.at is the online version of Neue Zürcher Zeitung dedicated for Austria only. It's a new venture that we started in January. I'm a subscriber, I can highly recommend it. Leads me to tonight's speakers, Dr. Olexander Scherba, the Ukrainian ambassador to Austria. Dr. Scherba has been serving for the in the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for, I think, 2 decades before he became ambassador to Austria. He worked in the crisis committee for Crimea in the East in the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry and was an advisor to the Ukrainian Vice President. Dr. Hannes Swoboda was member of the European Parliament for 18 years, and from 2012 to 2014 he was actually president of the parliamentary group of the Social Democrats in the European Parliament. He's been member of 15 committees, 11 delegations with a focus on foreign affairs, Southeastern Europe, and Russia. And finally, let me introduce also Mr. Christophe Kamp, Deputy EU Permanent Representative to the OSCE. I'm very pleased we have him here tonight, since the OSCE is playing an increasing role in trying to solve the current conflict. I think he has even fresh news from last night about a big decision was taken there, but I don't want to preempt the discussion. And I'm here finishing my introductory and leave the floor to Christophe Kamp. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you for the introduction, and I would like to start right into the discussion. And the first point that I would like to discuss is regarding the title that Mr. Vavrik chose, between appeasement and containment. And I would like to ask you, Mr. Scherba, you were tweeting today on your Twitter account that, I quote, "Sometimes when you look for the truth somewhere in between, you look for a lie. That's how the West gets lost between Ukraine and Russia. Truth ain't in between." So if we talk about between appeasement and between containment, do you think that's a lie? Do we have to choose? Do we have to set for a certain straight strategy?
What I was referring to in this particular tweet was more one of the traps that the West finds itself when trying to analyze the Ukrainian situation. The West turned out to be really easy to fool in this war that's is being waged against Ukraine right now. And one of the reasons is that the Western mind is really, used to look for the truth somewhere between the extremities, right? And so they think Ukrainians are saying something, one thing, Russians something else. The truth must be somewhere in between. So basically, if I would say Ukrainians are closer to truth than Russians, but to mislead the world opinion, you just have to say a lie, and the bigger the lie is, the further the lie is from the truth, the more disoriented the West will be. And this is what Russia is actually doing very successfully right now, making up things. Absolutely, crazy, unthinkable things that are absolutely beyond every, comprehension. And the West is, as usual, is looking for something in the middle, which leaves it with the lie. About the efforts to find the golden middle between containment and appeasement, containment and appeasement, right? Well, it's somewhere from the same order. Containment is bad. Appeasement is bad. It's absolutely, it's a wrong policy. It's a policy that will lead to more tragedies. Russia or Russian leadership likes to compare Russia to a bear. Well, this bear turned out to be some kind of a man-eater. Not such a nice, fluffy creature as was, posing in the Sochi Olympics, but a real man-eater that is actually that took away many lives and a big part of territory in Georgia in 2008, then withdrew to the hole. and the West seemed kind of, content and good, and actually this was kind of a situation that allowed to proceed with business as usual. Then the bear came out of the hole and bit a bigger part from Ukraine, and 6,000 people fell already victim to this war. And the hope is that the bear will be appeased again, will withdraw to his hole, and maybe it will happen. But a man-eater is a man-eater. So it will be back.
So in one sentence or two maybe, what would you expect the West to do?
First of all, to call a spade a spade. I mean, Russia is an aggressor. It's not separatists fighting against Ukraine. It's people either sent or fooled by Russian citizens under Russian flags with Russian weapons fighting on Ukraine's soil against Ukraine. So this is the kind of situation that we have right now. And Ukraine must be supported in this way. Ukraine is being punished for choosing democracy and freedom. Ukraine is being punished for the same kind of event this continent of ours is based upon, in Romania with Ceausescu, like the revolution in Czechoslovakia, and so on and so forth. And for some reason, Europe doesn't see this event like a continuation of this, process of, democratization of Europe and democracy spreading towards East. And this has to change.
Mr. Kamp, how would that change from the European Union perspective? And first of all, do you agree with what Mr. Scherba says? Sorry? The first one, how the European Union would react
to the Ukraine crisis as such.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I think
in the scale of appeasement and containment.
Right. Yeah, we don't discuss the Ukraine crisis in these terms, to be honest, appeasement or containment. I think I recognize some in what the ambassador of Ukraine says, that Europe was, I think, taken by. I wouldn't say surprise, but I think the European Union, what happened in Maidan 1 year ago, with many people to the streets, and then the European Union tried to help find a political solution to the conflict by sending foreign ministers to negotiate. I don't think we expected that the president at that time would then flee and then we would have a different situation. What I would not agree with is the notion that the EU or the European countries don't see what's happening. I think on the contrary, I think we make very clear within the OSCE every week what is happening and that Russia backs the separatists, including with people on the ground and also arms on the ground. So I think we are very clear about that. Then the question, of course, is what do we do? We have tried to negotiate with Russia, Ukraine and a few member states of the European Union to stop the ceasefire, to stop the violence and to have a ceasefire and to have some sort of a political process to take us further. It's a very difficult process. Russia uses its military to obtain a goal. There was an interesting interview in a newspaper, not only yours but also others, which showed that Russian soldiers, although called volunteers, volunteer to actually go to Ukraine. And I think that reality is very clear for all of us. What we try to do is work to find a political solution, and we combine that with sanctions. Economic sanctions, we try to combine that also with strengthening the OSCE, which has a large mission on the ground, to know what's happening in the east of the country, and to support efforts to de-escalate. And at the same time, we do also have a longer-term agenda, because we very much recognize that Ukraine and its leadership wants to reform. have a stronger democracy. So I support Ukraine with efforts to achieve these goals.
Mr. Swoboda? Political sanctions and political diplomacy as such, will that be enough? What do you think from your experience in dealing with this conflict?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation here to this debate. I think it's a good idea that political parties, together with the Diplomatic Academy, try to broaden the discussions, and especially if there are many young people here. I mean, we have to start, and we have to bring some alternatives, because otherwise there's no discussion. Also, to what the ambassador said, we had already a discussion on another occasion. We have to start with what happened. What happened was that the European Union offered Ukraine to go the way towards Europe. At that time, and I had a discussion with President Yanukovych, the Prime Minister Azarov, and Mr. Kloyev, and others. At that time, everybody said, yes, we want. Of course, there were some hesitations here and there, but everybody said, yes, we want. I don't know that everybody was not really meaning what they said. And if the ambassador says, yes, we choose democracy and European way, yes, many of the young people who have been at the Maidan did choose that way. Some people who were there did not choose that way. And some people who are still now governing the country is not really choosing that way. And that is one of the problems. One of the problems is that Ukraine in the past did not fulfill certain minimum conditions. First of all, to have an army who couldn't defend themselves. Maybe it was intentional not to have a functioning army, but it was not existing. And nobody of the people who are now in power really did anything, or their friends politically did anything for that. Secondly, many people, especially in the eastern part, were not happy about Kiev. When I was in Kharkiv, and I'm not an expert on all the regions there, but it was very clear that there's certainly nobody, neither Yanukovych, nor Timoshenko, nor Yushchenko, nobody did anything for our region to that what is called decentralization. Still, I'm waiting for it. So it's a bit strange, but this is the usual game. You know, for everything Europe is responsible. It's strange that for the things which were going wrong also in the past in Ukraine, it's always Europe is responsible. Maybe Ukraine also was responsible and still is responsible. If you look, democracy, yeah, well, many of the parties are directed, formally or informally, by oligarchs. They are still there. They are still the real powerful people. This is not the European way. Now, of course, we have it, we have Berlusconi in Italy and others, but it's not what we, and I think even what NEOS would like to have. So if the Ukrainians who are now in power would do their job better, of course the ambassador has to defend it, it's not against him here, he's representing his country, maybe it would be easier also to win people in Europe to support Ukraine. Of course we have to support Ukraine. And as I said, I met really young people who have energetic and had good ideas, but they are lost also. They are lost also with that kind of policy they have. And also everything is now Russia responsible. Yes, Russia is an aggressor. We can agree on that. And it was absolutely not justified to take Crimea and to support the people there. But why do they get the support in the country? And by the way, what happened in Odessa is not so clear that it was Russia. So, and if you look, and I read, because I get now daily the report from the OSCE, it's not so only Russia who is preventing to come to a solution in the area. Appeasement, you know, it became modern after some time that everything is appeasement if you speak, and everything is Munich. That's not the reality. Mistakes have been done, and what we did some mistakes, and Russia did an aggression. Yes, but we have to come out of it. Do we want war? Do we want weapons? Not knowing where the weapons are going, into the right-wing militias who are fighting there, or maybe the Russians get them afterwards. Yes, Europe is for a political situation. It's not so easy, Mr. Ambassador, for some of the companies, for example, who are losing contracts, and it's not only the companies, but the people who are losing jobs. So it's a bit, I think, superstitious and arrogant if some people, not you, Mr. Ambassador, but some people say you have to give money. It was here also some days ago, I think you were there, professor from Poland, who did a very good description and analysis of the European Union. I agreed with most of it. And see some people here who were there some days ago. But just to say give money and that's it, or give arms and that's it, without demanding that Ukrainians do their job themselves, I don't think that is acceptable. And therefore, we have to find a solution. If I see, look, Russia under Putin, unfortunately, is a very negative, they take a very negative development, also internal. And to some friends who want to explain that Putin maybe is not so bad, I explain even domestically is very bad what is developing in Russia. But we had Russia under the Soviet communism. Was it, and still there we did not go to war with the communist Russia. We tried to find a modus vivendi to come to a solution. Maybe this is for the second round, and I think there are some possibilities. We have, of course, our point of view, and we extended European Union, and we extended NATO, but we did not think about how can we involve Russia into a new European order. It's now 100 years since the Congress of Vienna, when everybody was sitting together and trying to find a new solution. It was in 1945 that the powers came together. Unfortunately, it was the basis of the division of Europe. But it was 1975. We discussed with very ugly dictators and found an agreement in Helsinki. Maybe it's time again that we think about all European construction to bring in Russia, hoping that Mr. Putin, I don't know what's happening with him now, but is not forever leader in Russia. We have to refrain from a primitive anti-Russian policy. It's an anti-Putin and Putin policy and strategy we have to do, but not always say it's an come close to an anti-Russian position, because we need Russia in some way to find new stability and new security structures in Europe.
Thank you. Mr. Vavrik, is Mr. Swoboda an appeaser?
No, I don't think he's an appeaser. Actually, Mr. Swoboda is a firm partner of containment. That's how I would interpret his saying. When he says we should not have a policy against Russia, but against the current policy of Mr. Putin, and we have to be patient, one day he will be gone, that's for me the foundation of a containment policy that is not directed against a country. Russia is part of Europe, Russia is our neighbor, Russia will stay there, we cannot change geography, but Mr. Putin will go away. And if I may go back, I disagree with you a little bit, Mr. Ambassador. I think that most European top politicians have a very, very clear view of where the blame lies, of who is the aggressor and who not. I mean, I may refer only to one of them, one of the most important players in Europe, Mrs. Merkel. If you read her speech at the Munich conference 3 weeks ago, she was very, very clear about talking a breach of international law, about the Budapest Memorandum, etc. And in the objectives of her policy, she was also very clear. She said, we will not accept a change of borders by force, and we will not accept that a European country has limited sovereignty and be dictated by another one, whether it wants to join the EU or not, or NATO or not, whatever. So for me, this is the basis of a containment policy. And if I go through what's happening on Europe, whether it's Finland thinking about joining NATO, whether it's Sweden, I think a couple of days ago, deciding to boost up defense spending by 600 million euro, whether it's Poland deciding to boost up spending by, to 2%, whether it's the NATO setting up headquarters, regional headquarters, or the rapid deployment force, etc., etc. All these element of a containment policy, and I do not ascribe to the word containment policy, how should I say, a bad taste. I think, on the contrary, it's a very wise policy of, on the one hand, not escalating, not engaging into a counteroffensive, and I mean by that not only militarily but also economically. The sanctions against Russia could have been much, much harsher. You could, for instance, exclude Russia from the SWIFT system, and that it would really hurt. The West has not done it and shouldn't do it. So it's a policy of not escalating, not going into the counteroffensive. But it's also a policy of saying, okay, we have to stop it. We really have to make sure that this doesn't go further because of the danger of it. Now, maybe we overestimate the threat from Russia. I don't know whether Russia is a man-eating beast who will come again out of its hold and grab for more. Maybe yes, maybe not. But not knowing whether, not being sure, it's probably a wise policy to assume the worst from the beginning. But it should certainly not turn into an anti-Russian policy, because to allow Russia, when the time is ripe, to return to a modus vivendi with Europe and to be part of Europe, actually, and to return to a way of operating which sets the priorities in a different way. The wealth of its own people. You said very rightly, Mr. President, that the current Russian policy is also very bad for its own people. I think Mr. Putin will go down in history as a man who sacrificed one more generation. I mean, the Soviets sacrificed 3 generations of Russians. Around the turn of the millennium, around the year 2000, it looked like, okay, Russia is getting out of it, and now he sacrificed one more generation, regrettably for the Russians themselves. So I'm a firm believer in a containment policy, and I do, although the word is not used, and policymakers deny it, of course, then they're thinking those terms. What we see de facto is a containment policy, and I think it's the right policy. The alternative of appeasement policy is very dangerous, because it's tantamount to giving some terms of legitimacy to it, of legitimacy. Okay, the Russians have their vested interest, and you must understand them, etc. But it ends up saying, well, okay, we accept that a country sets its priorities and its means to achieve those priorities in a way that the rest of Europe has given up, in a way that is 19th century Europe or partly 20th century. You know, blood and land thinking, use of force, priority of power and geopolitics over the wealth of its own people, etc., etc. I could go on like that.
You're talking about containment and talking about stages of escalation. There's one stage of escalation that we've been talking about for the last weeks, that is arms and weapons deliveries to Ukraine or to the Ukrainian army. Mr. Scherba? America, yesterday, I think, Joe Biden was talking on the phone to Mr. Petro Poroshenko, and they made a deal for a new weapons trade, about $75 million worth. Do you expect the European Union or the Western Europe to join in on those deals?
Well, first of all, the deal that was reached in Washington was about delivering Ukraine some Humvees, some vehicles.
Which are declared military goods.
Yeah, military goods, but yeah, still, you know, if you consider this, you don't believe it will be some game changer, right, in this war. So if Ukrainian army all of a sudden is better equipped to travel through own country, it's not really what's gonna. Well, it is a big deal, of course. It's important, but when Ukraine was saying we want the defensive weapons, first of all, it was what we meant was anti-tank missiles. We are not getting it yet. And whoever says we are against, supplying Ukraine with defensive weapons because we want to prevent a war in Europe, is in reality saying, I'm fine with Russians killing Ukrainians, I just don't want this war to spread nearer to my borders. It's not appeasement even. It's some, well, it's some delusion, and a little bit of indifference. I am Ukrainian. My people get killed for nothing. So I cannot agree with this kind of position. I will always debate with this and many other points that Mr. Swoboda said, and let me respond to them very briefly. I think if we want this to be a debate, we should allow a debate. First of all, the point that Ukraine, the whole situation right now is in many ways Ukraine's fault because Ukrainian army wasn't, and Ukraine as a state and Ukrainian army wasn't prepared to respond to such actions by Russia. Well, let me remind you that two of the latest defense ministers of Ukraine under Yanukovych government had the Russian citizenship, as it turned out. What was the rationale of appointing Russian citizens, the defense ministers of Ukraine? I think it's quite clear that Yanukovych wasn't really acting in Ukraine's interest by picking these individuals, in part very notorious individuals, to manage Ukrainian army. And no wonder that after such decisions, Ukraine was completely unprepared for the kind of backstabbing that we faced from Russia. Second of all, about, again, continuing the line that it's Ukraine's fault. First of all, Ukraine would be the last country and the last nation blaming this whole situation on Europe. Mr. Swoboda, you must, if you have spoken to Ukrainians, you should know better than anybody else that we are prone to blame everything on ourselves. We are very much, self-blaming nation. So, and we were the ones dying under EU flags. I don't know which other country was actually had such a precedent of their youth dying under EU flags for their nation to have EU future. So we are not blaming Europe, and we are not denying that Ukraine has these division lines like many other countries. But it takes something to turn a division line into a war. And this something is, in this particular case, is called hateful Russia. Russia filled with hate, not only towards us, but towards you, towards the West. And this is something the West has still has to recognize. Please, I encourage everybody in the West, learn Russian. Just for the possibility to watch the Russian TV and to experience what kind of hatred is brewing in the public TV, in the public mass media towards the West. Then you would discover that Austria is one of the reasons why this whole mess is happening right now. You didn't know that. Austria is being blamed for that because Ukraine is an artificial project started by the Austrian General Staff in early 20th century because they wanted, already back then, they wanted to weaken Russia. So Austria, Germany, America, it's everyone's fault, but not Russia's. We understand the pains of the Austrian and Western companies suffering from the sanctions. We understand, and it pains us to see that our way to Europe starts with such predicament for many businessmen and businesses and smaller and medium businesses here in Europe. But just try to understand the difference of perspectives here. If the Union of Russian Soldier Mothers is right about nearly 5,000 Russian soldiers secretly falling victim to this war, and if you add this to 6,000 Ukrainians already who already died in this war, it makes 11,000 people. And in the same time, Austria says 11,000 jobs can be cut and lost as a result of the sanctions. So, which is also immensely painful. But these are two different perspectives: 11,000 lives and 11,000 jobs. So please feel our pain too. About the need that we need Russia back as a partner. Russia is the country that brought that threw Europe back into reality of annexations, of territorial disputes, of wars under the flag of under pretense of defending national minorities, somewhat must ring a bell. Somewhere in the past we had already such precedent. So it's not, of course, everybody needs Russia back as a partner, but right now, it's a little bit, the timing is a little bit more complicated than that. Right now, you, Mr. Swoboda, were saying we don't need an anti-Putin policy, an anti-Russian policy. It so happens, no?
I said we need an anti-Putin, but not an anti-Russian.
Good, because this is the point where I completely agree with you. Putin's policy is anti-Russian policy. And anti-Putin, by definition, policy is pro-Russian policy. This is something, the nice distinction you have to draw. I have many more, remarks, but I'm sorry for being so long.
You want to answer?
No. As far as it should not be a bilateral discussion, but as far as I understood, you started with blaming Europe. And I just wanted to say, don't blame Europe. There are many elements also inside. And as I said, Europe tries to find a solution as we tried to find a solution also in the past, even with the Soviet communist regimes. So that is, I think, what is necessary. And second element is, and I still would insist on that, it is easier to convince our people for any kind of containment policy, and of course we need containment. It's absolutely clear we cannot accept any country to go in that, invading other countries. I would have liked that people would have joined when the US invaded Iraq. It's a different thing, but nevertheless, we should also see the reality. The reality is today, and that's not together with Ukraine as such, that the one infringement and occupation and so on is criticized. The other was a different thing. But many things we have in the Middle East was also because of a military intervention. Let's go to Ukraine. Yes, we need containment. We cannot allow that some country is just invading another country and taking part of it or fighting the separatists. But the only thing we have to discuss, and I would like also Ukrainians to discuss more, is what are the elements which contributed, which gave Russia the possibility to go into and have a lot of people there supporting them, and what is even the more important question is how can we come out of it? And because your question was also about the armament, of course that depends on Russia. I'm nothing against the threat that the US is going and saying we will go into the armament, but let's be honest. I mean, it's far away from the US. They don't send their soldiers. People die here. We in Europe have to find a solution. I'm not an anti-American, this is now modern, or since in Austria anyway, it's modern to be always against the US and also with TTIP and so on. But Europe has to find a solution. I'm really for having an alliance with the US, but not being the servants of the US. And the US is dominating politics again, also in this issue. They have any problems because they don't have these kind of economic relations. They are far away, and no, I think we should decide here in Europe what to do, and it's our responsibility to find a solution.
If you have to decide in Europe what to do, then a decision about weapons or weapon deliveries through Ukraine would be a European decision. What does the panel think about that, Mr. Swoboda?
Well, again, I think we still are in the phase of trying to find a peaceful solution. You can discuss who is more responsible, who is less withdrawing the weapons. I think still is not the time. If Russia would continue and would really go into deep aggression, then of course I would say it's a necessary consequence. But first of all, we have to try to find a solution, a comprehensive solution for the European security system. Every offer, it was taken serious or not, every offer of Medvedev and Putin in the past have been rejected. Every offer. We didn't even test them. when Putin spoke in the German Bundestag, when Medvedev had the plan for an energy union, had the plan for a European security strategy, maybe it was fake, I don't know, but we didn't test it. And now is the test. Now the European Union would have to say, okay, let's sit together. What is your proposal? And is it a feasible proposal? If Putin thinks we can, divide Europe and US in the sense of NATO out of Europe, it's a failure. And then we don't have to discuss. Even from a neutral country position, we don't have to discuss. If, says, we have a security system where also NATO plays a role in Europe, and we can find something with Putin, but we have to try. Nobody is trying to have an overall European security or economic association, whatever. And we cannot live in Europe and having Russia always outside every kind of institutional effect, besides the Council of Europe. But that's not a real, institution who can bring security to Europe.
Can I?
Who wants to go?
Sorry, sorry for monopolizing this.
No, perhaps, I mean, your comments, Swoboda, about in European security architecture, of course, efforts are now being made to start that. Although it's, of course, also difficult to talk, but we have to, while people fight and while we qualify Russian policy in Ukraine as aggression. But we have to indeed to do that. And within the OSCE, last year, the then Swiss chairmanship started an initiative to have a discussion panel with high-level, mostly former leading public persons to reflect exactly on this question. And it includes also people from Russia, the United States, and different countries in Europe, EU, non-EU. Next year, Germany will hold the chairmanship of the OSCE 2016, and then I believe they will be very much inspired by what will come out of those discussions. But from our point of view, as a European Union and the EU member states, we should not rewrite the rules. I mean, we have to rethink where we can have a common security architecture. But if you look at what we were able to agree in 1975 in Helsinki, where we speak about inviolability of borders, etc. I mean, I think these are principles which we at least would seek very much to maintain. And I think we have to reflect on how to better implement or how to better partner, and how to do that. Because I also agree with you that Russia, it is a force which we need in dealing with Iran, with many other issues in the Middle East. And we need to find a way to work with Russia, while at the same time being very clear that if it is crossing lines, that we should call it that way, that we should respond. But this reflection process will certainly happen this year.
Do you think there's a time span for the reflection process? Do you think that after... Sorry?
Microphone.
So sorry. Do you think there's a time span for that reflection process that you were talking about? We're seeing peace agreement after peace agreement being neglected.
I think we have two different processes at the same time. One is a very uncertain situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine. A month ago, a ceasefire was negotiated, plus a number of political steps on issues related to reform, on constitutional issues, exchange of prisoners, on the humanitarian situation, and of course the withdrawal of heavy weapons. It's a very fluid situation, and it's very difficult to predict what will happen in 1 week, in 1 month, even beyond. And at the same time, we have to do this more long-term reflection on the European security architecture. So we have to do these two things at the same time, and obviously both will impact each other. I think if the situation on the ground would further deteriorate, at the moment the EU is not ready to send arms as such. The EU couldn't do it, it's a member state's competence, but apart from, I think, the UK sending trainers, I don't think, but perhaps other member states are considering these kinds of steps as well. But it's difficult to predict. The situation on the ground may change in 1 month, and then we could have a very different situation. But this thinking on the European security architecture, the panel, it's a panel of eminent persons, as it is called in the OSCE. They will meet again soon. They will have a first reflection discussion with a larger audience in June this year. And as I said, at the end of this year, the German chairmanship of the OSCE will start working for its chairmanship in 2016. These are, it sounds far away, it is far away for a very current conflict, but we have to do it.
Mr. Vavrik, it seems like if you read the newspapers every day that Vladimir Putin seems to have a plan that nobody really knows where it's going to end, and the European Union does a lot of reflections. That's a provocative way of saying that. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that's the right strategy?
I will not, but it's very difficult to, nobody can read into Mr. Putin's mind, but I think everybody can agree that it's a system, a regime that very much depends on the decision of one man, which makes it difficult, of course. He doesn't feel obviously answerable, at least not openly and directly, to any constituency. Some people say, well, you know, indirectly he's answerable to the oligarchs. If the oligarchs really get hit hard, he may have to give up. I'm not so sure. Of course, for him it's an advantage. He can take decisions alone, quickly, and implement it. And on the other hand, he has 28 states with different interests, different constituencies, answerable to the electorate, for instance, and also to the business interests, etc., with different perspective. You cannot compare the view that Poland or the Baltic states have on those events with that of a country like Portugal, right? And so, for me, it is quite remarkable, actually. I see that the EU has managed to have, so far, a quite united front. And I think that, in retrospect, I don't think Mr. Putin would have expected that they would agree to levy those sanctions against Russia. We may consider them feeble, I consider them feeble, but that they exist and are upheld is per se remarkable. I would add one thing. The arms to Ukraine is a very interesting question, of course, because it reveals really how we see the conflict. It has been, everybody repeats like a mantra, okay, it has to be a diplomatic solution, and therefore delivering arms is out of question. Now, I'm a little bit surprised because it sounds like, okay, a country has not the right to defend itself. I mean, I'm the defense speaker of my party, and Austria produces very few arms. We produce the Glock pistol and an assault rifle. Everything else we have in the Austrian army, we buy from abroad, right? So we ourselves, as a neutral country, think that we have the right to buy arms to defend ourselves. So why should Russia not have this right? And as Mr.
Ukraine.
The Ukraine, sorry. And as Mr. Swoboda rightly...
Right, they don't have the money.
They don't have the money. Okay, that's another question. You could sell them on credit. But as Mr. Swoboda rightly pointed out, the Ukraine army was totally unprepared for whatever reasons. Maybe it had been betrayed by their own Ministry of Defense. But so if you follow this logic, you could say, well, maybe as part of a comprehensive approach, okay, some limited arms delivery of a defensive nature could be part of the solution. They could be part. I'm not saying they're the key element. I'm not saying they're a priority. But either, I don't feel at ease when they're excluded a priori, okay? Because it is obvious this conflict has a military dimension, right? And it's not out of choice of either Europe or Ukraine. I mean, the military dimension is there. And there are a lot of foreign arms in the Ukraine. Those are Russian arms, right? Not European arms, and okay, some American equipment now in form Humvees and some night goggles and things like that in limited quantities. So to come back to the European strategy, I think it is a little bit late to redraw the past. And by the way, I don't fully agree with you, Mr. Swoboda. I think the EU and the West made huge efforts to integrate Russia into the system, and over certain periods it was quite successful. I may refer to getting Russia into the WTO. I refer to the cooperation between Russia and the US in transiting US personnel for the war in Afghanistan. I refer to the Iran sanctions. I refer to the Russia-NATO treaty, etc., etc. Now, there's been ups and downs, and currently we are in a deep down. But it's not correct to say that the question is more, does Russia still want it today? When I read Mr. Putin's speeches and other people's, I feel like they don't want to be part of Europe. They have a different view. They don't share our liberal order, even domestically. Things like the focus on the nation, on a version of how call it when you like your country of patriotism. Okay, a version of patriotism that we have put behind us. I think the Western Europe indicates that I'm not sure that Russia as a whole is really willing to rejoin this concept of nations of Western Europe. So a comprehensive European strategy has to take the elements that you referred to, Mr. Kamp. It's complex, it's lengthy. I'm again referring to Mrs. Merkel, and not because I'm a fan of Mrs. Merkel, but because she's a big player and she has invested considerable effort herself, and also some political capital in trying to help. And at the Munich conference, when she was asked, okay, what's next? She said two things. It was very interesting because it refers also to what I interpreted as a containment policy. She said, this will require two things. It will require unity and resolve within Europe, first, and second, it will require time. So she was not optimistic at that time that this could be solved within a short framework. She was referring to time and unity. And this reminds me, yes, it reminds me of a containment policy of back then 30 or 40 years ago, whether we like it or not.
I was looking at my watch, it's 6 o'clock now, so are there any questions already that you would like to ask?
You want me to carry the mic? Okay. Carry the mic. You did indicate me.
Sure.
Very interesting. And one comment and one question. The comment is, why should not Ukraine get anti-tank missiles? Because when there are foreign tanks on their soil. The first question. And the second is, why did we, in the West, succumb to Putin's disinformation policy and propaganda policy? If you read the newspapers, you see much more of the Russian positions, understanding for Russian positions than for the Ukrainians. At least this is my impression. I don't know if you share that. Thank you.
Who are you directing the question to? Mrs. Swoboda? To everybody. Okay.
Can I start? Yeah, first of all, thank you for your first question, which was actually the formulation of what I should have formulated as in the first place. And indeed, there are foreign tanks on Ukrainian soil, but they are not allowed to be countered by foreign anti-tank missiles. And second of all, the West is easily fooled by Russia because the West, in part, wants to be fooled, because the truth is too painful to watch. The truth is that you have to say goodbye to Europe as you know. And you have to make enormous sacrifice, including those 11,000, lost jobs in Austria. I mean, you have to either recognize that or to believe in Nazis, in Nazi Ukraine. And believing in Nazi Ukraine is so much easier for Europe and for many people in Russia too, because what Putin and Putin government is doing is unthinkable. It's basically barring the country's way into future. And you have either to recognize this, just as the fact that Russia is killing Ukrainians for nothing, and basically, or you believe in Nazi Ukraine. It's very easy, and this is just, this is the way people psychologically choose.
Maybe some followers of Mr. Strache are believing in Nazi Ukraine, but I don't see also, Ambassador, that Russian position. Where is the Russian position so hailed? In the television, surely not, and in radio. So I think it's not true that. Of course, it's not only always blaming Russia for everything. But I don't see this imbalance that Russia is seen more positively than Ukraine. That's not true. It's not my feeling. And on the weapons, of course, Ukraine can buy any weapon they want to buy. The problem is, of course, the financial situation. But if the US delivers weapons, it is as if the US takes part in the war. This is a limitation. And therefore, I think that's understandable, because even the US until now only spoke about it, but didn't do it. So I think it's not true that they are denied weapons, especially weapons against the tanks.
I don't, what we see is, of course, a much bigger effort in Russia on propaganda, throwing out, first of all, of course, in Russia, but also outside Russia on all of us. And we, from European countries, we have less of a tradition to do that. In our own countries, let alone to other countries. The problem is very recognized, though, because it has taken such extreme views. And policymakers within EU countries, I think, are very much aware of the need to counter that. But there are different ways of doing that. And it may not be the same, let's say, hardcore propaganda way we are confronted with, but it may mean perhaps investing much more in people-to-people contact, or reaching out to different generations in Russia. I don't recognize also the image that Russia is much more positively portrayed in media than Ukraine. I think, on the contrary, at least newspapers I read, but I think it would indeed be good to read Russian media to know exactly what is coming at us. I do not agree, though, that the West or Europe is being fooled. I think we are confronted with an extremely difficult conflict, which takes very difficult steps to find a solution for, and there are no easy answers for that. I cannot comment on the weapons. Member states of the EU make their individual choices on that. Some argue it may actually be better if we would send some weapons because it may force Russia back to the negotiation table. Others may say, well, we don't know what will happen next. There may be an escalation. And it's a calculation each of these member states make while discussing how to find a way out of this.
May I counter what Mr. Swoboda said? It's not only a money matter, the supply of weapons. You understand that? Yeah, I mean, it's Putin's point that I have nothing to do with this because modern weapons can be bought in a grocery store. No, they cannot. Maybe some Humvees, I mean, can be bought on a free market, but I mean, what he's supplying, these tornado missiles that have been used in the last couple of months, they have been basically deployed only by Russian armed forces, and these are the most modern weapons that one can imagine. They are being deployed on Ukrainian soil right now, and these, Javelin anti-tank missiles that we want to acquire, it's not something that one can buy in a grocery store either. So it must be really something, a political decision, and this political decision, it hasn't been made yet, and many Ukrainian soldiers, civilians are paying with their lives and their blood for the lack of the political decision.
Johan Bresnik, good evening. This question is directed mainly at Mr. Swoboda, but the others as well. In reference to what you said, Europe being a partner to the United States and not a servant. I see a huge problem there, being that we see it, in my opinion, now with this conflict, that we cannot be a partner as long as we cannot Russia does not have to fear consequences from us, basically. We are like a parent telling their kids, stop doing this, but they always know there will not be any consequences. I do not propose war, but Russia knows that from our side, there will never be any consequences. Our military expenses are ridiculously low. in Austria, for example, but in most of the European Union. So how do we change that if we basically if Russia never has to fear any consequences?
Well, big powers always have the advantage, like the US. Did the US have any consequences when they invaded Iraq? No. Even some European countries participated in an obviously illegal action. I mean, that's reality. If big power use force, it's very difficult to counter and to make a containment. Where is written that automatic NATO, and even the EU, as was just said before, is not a defense community, can react immediately? We are, fantasizing things which are not existing. European Union is not. Now, Mr. Juncker speaks about an army. I don't know when we will have it, but this is not the issue. Here is NATO. And NATO tries to do what it can, but it's very, the generals in the NATO would perhaps like a war, but the politicians responsible try to find a way to avoid it, which is quite reasonable if you think about the victims, as the ambassador said. Yes, it's unfortunately, but the containment can only be done by a military organization, not by a civil organization like European Union.
But how can you draw the parallels between Ukraine war and Iraq war?
It's not a parallel.
Absolutely. I mean, I understand that. Well, this is the narrative Putin wants the whole world to be dragged in, but it's unjustified. I mean, really, how can you compare a country being punished for their choice of freedom and democracy on the one hand, and being punished so brutally? So absolutely, I mean, it's the meanest, the war that one can imagine. Basically, they send in troops, they fool their own citizens to the extent that they volunteer to go to Ukraine and to kill Ukrainians on the one hand, and then you drop the parallels to Iraq, where there was this brutal dictator with this genocide against Kurds and so on and so forth. Who were Ukrainian Kurds? Who committed genocide in Ukraine? There was no such premise whatsoever. So it's a slippery path. We shouldn't walk it.
Ich heiße Alex. Ich möchte bitte den Herrn Zotto und Herrn Swoboda bitten, dann die Fragen zu übersetzen, weil mein Englisch ist leider sehr schlecht. Als Erster möchte ich mich beim Herrn Botschafter bedanken, dass er sich trotz der momentanen Lage sich dieser Diskussion öffentlich stellt. Da muss man wirklich mal Danke sagen. Unsere Politiker, glaube ich, trauen sich nicht so öffentlich dazu Stellung zu nehmen. Der erste Punkt ist, ich finde es nicht in Ordnung, dass Russland immer nur als Aggressor dargestellt wird. Ich glaube, es muss klargestellt werden.
Gibt es da noch eine Frage?
Ja,
okay.
Also nicht nur Russland hat Interessen leider in der Ukraine, sondern die EU und die Vereinigten Staaten und die NATO sind ebenso als Akteure dort. Und die westlichen Medien sind sicherlich um keinen Deut objektiver als die russischen Medien. Auf die Frage, was ich eben kommen will, an Herrn Botschafter, wäre es nicht sinnvoll, in dieser sehr kritischen Lage wirklich den NATO-Beitritt für 20 Jahre aufzuschieben, einen vorübergehend neutralen Status anzunehmen und sich wesentlich mehr in der Bewegung der Blockfreien anzuschließen und vielleicht auch den EU-Beitritt ein bisschen hinten nachzustellen?
Der Botschafter kann Deutsch.
Also deswegen
übersetze ich es nicht. Also ich würde gleich weter.
Soll ich dann antworten? Ja. Erstmal, Russland wird nicht als Aggressor dargestellt. Russland ist der Aggressor, weil der Krieg wird auf dem ukrainischen Boden mit ukrainischen Waffen, mit russischen Waffen unter russischen Fahnen von russischen Staatsbürgern mit russischen Waffen, mit Unterstützung der russischen Propaganda durchgeführt. Und es ist egal, wie lange und wie viel Milliarden Russland verschwendet, um diese Tatsache zu leugnen. Die Tatsache ist, das ist ein Krieg Russlands gegen die Ukraine. Und nicht, weil Russland so dargestellt wird, weit davon. Und was die NATO-Perspektive angeht, wir haben nicht um die NATO-Mitgliedschaft gebeten, wir haben einfach diese Option für die Zukunft geöffnet. Das ist ein feiner Unterschied hier. Und ich weiß nicht, ob es Ihnen bewusst ist, Anfang des Jahres, als dieser Krieg gerade angefangen war, war die NATO-Mitgliedschaft Unterstützung in der Ukraine 14–15%. Ende letztes Jahres war das 55–60%. Also wir sind diejenigen, die bluten. Wir sind diejenigen, deren Söhne in Särgen zurückkommen und Kinder. Und wir sind eine Nation in Schmerz. Und das ist nicht die Situation, in der wir sagen, ja, wir werden niemals, wir werden jetzt versprechen, die nächsten 20 Jahre um die NATO-Mitgliedschaft uns nicht bewerben, nur damit Russland beschwichtigt wird. Wir glauben nicht an Beschwichtigung Russlands. Wir glauben nicht. Wir standen zu nahe an Russland. Wir haben Russland zu geliebt. Das ist nicht so wie ich habe Russland geliebt. Das war ein Land, das mir wirklich sehr viel bedeutet hat. Und sehr vielen Millionen Menschen in der Ukraine. Jetzt fühlen wir uns betrayed, wie sagt man auf Deutsch? Verraten, ja. Und das ist ein absoluter, ein Wandel, ein psychologischer Wandel, den die Ukraine im letzten Jahr durchgemacht hat. Und das ist ganz natürlich. Und es ist ganz natürlich, dass gegeben diesen Wandel die Ukraine die entsprechenden politischen Mandate ihren Politikern gegeben hat in den Wahlen. Also das ist eine ganz natürliche Entscheidung, diese Option für die Zukunft freizuhalten. Aber das wird dann die Entscheidung der NATO sein, ob die Ukraine dann aufgenommen wird oder nicht, gegebenenfalls. Aber allein diese Tatsache als eine Provokation gegen Russland zu deuten und sogar sie als ein Vorwand für die Fortsetzung dieses Krieges zu nutzen, das ist eine Travestie.
Ich bin absolut gegen den Krieg. Es war einfach nur, um eine Spannung zu suchen. Die Militärhilfe.
Ja, logisch gedacht, ja, ich sehe die Logik in dem, was Sie sagen, aber wir sind im Schmerz.
Damit sind Sie nicht allein.
Bitte?
Damit sind Sie sicher nicht allein.
Ja.
I also heard in the question the responsibility of, let's say, Europe and the United States in the conflict in Ukraine, if I understood it correctly. And this is an argument which Russia has put very strongly a year ago when the crisis really went beyond control, with the argument that the expansion of the European Union has contributed to the crisis in Ukraine. The European Union has negotiated with different Ukrainian governments on stronger economic relations, whether it was following Yushchenko's coming to power in 2004 or Yanukovych later on. The different governments of Ukraine saw merit in having stronger economic relations with the European Union because it would mean more access for Ukrainian companies to a large economic market, increasing of standards, strengthening rule of law, and perhaps not everybody in the Ukrainian leadership supported it, but there was a strong push also from the business sector in Ukraine to do that. Now, our approach towards not only Ukraine but also other countries is, if countries want to do that, then they have to make sure that they reach certain criteria for reform, etc. And if countries don't meet these criteria, then we can't do it. So it was not as if the European Union at any cost was trying to sign trade, bilateral trade, relations with Ukraine or other countries. Of course, the European Union is interested in stable neighbors and in strengthening rule of law. Of course, also expanding its economic market. But this is where we come from. And if Ukraine, as a sovereign country, decides to choose its own future and decides to choose its own economic relationships with neighboring countries, then it's up to Ukraine to decide whether to do it or not, and not to others. Of course, there was big disappointment among many people in Europe when President Yanukovych decided not to sign the association agreement at the very end of 2013. But still, it was respected because, well, if this is the choice, then we don't like it, but this is where you go. We strongly believe that it's very much the Russian policy to object to Ukraine having these stronger relationships with Europe, be it political or economic. And I think here we reach then very dangerous territory. Why would it be up to Russia to decide what relationships Ukraine would choose to have?
Yeah, basically, one of my questions is, I mean, European countries are not willing selling weapons to Ukraine because they're fearing an escalation. But at the same time, Europe is allowing Daimler-Benz to have a joint venture with one of the most important manufacturer of military vehicles in Russia. For me, it doesn't make sense.
Who are you asking?
Basically, the European Union. I mean, like, how can the European Union deny, or basically not allow Ukraine weapons buying, Ukraine buying weapons in the European Union, and at the same time allowing a joint venture between Daimler-Benz and one of the most important Russian military manufacturers?
Well, what I do know is that there is an arms embargo against Russia from the European Union. I'm not aware about the specifics of joint ventures of certain companies, but the European Union, by consensus, all 28 member states decided there's an arms embargo against Russia. That's the only answer I can give.
But you read in the papers from time to time, it's either Greece or Italy that they conduct some military business with Russia. I don't know whether I hope it's not true, but it is worrisome.
May I
Russian newspapers, perhaps?
No.
May I add one thing to the arms delivery question? I'm one of the very few politicians, at least in the Austrian Parliament, who in the subcommittee, parliamentary subcommittee, said, well, you know, hold on with this notion that never any arms to Ukraine. I'm quite alone there. On the other hand, I must say that I'm not sure that if delivery even to anti-tank missiles would be productive if this causes a breaking up of the united front within Europe, okay? Because then I think Ukraine would lose if yes, it would be supplied with a few dozens or a few hundred missiles or other weaponry, but if the price to it that it gives an excuse or a reason for the united front of Europe to break up, and some countries say, okay, that's it, I had it, this going into war, I'm out of it, okay? Then I think it would be, the Ukraine would lose. And then I would like to make one remark to you, Mr. Swoboda. You mentioned, what can we do with great powers act this way? And I was thinking, yeah, but who is we? We are Europe. Europe is 3.5 times the population of Russia. It's 8 times its GDP. Russia is a country which, from its industrial structure, is a third world country. I mean, it's exporting raw materials only. And I think, by the way, that Russia is suffering a lot. I mean, they're not facing military reprisals, but they are paying an increasing cost for their policy. So the sad thing is that Europe has not managed to act like a big power, although it should be a big power. But that's a longer-term debate, and I found it very interesting that you, as a social democrat, say, thank God we have NATO.
Never denied that.
Hello. Thank you very much. I think my question is directed. you. This is best directed towards Ambassador Scherba. I was wondering how far or how would the Ukrainian government guarantee the very large Russian minority new rights or new status of rights? Because the way I see this, they are Putin's excuse number one to act the way he's acting. And as long as they are not satisfied with their status within Ukraine, I don't see really an end to the conflict. Thank you.
Well, you said the key word, the excuse. It's just an excuse to conduct this war. If this excuse isn't, used, then there will be something else found. But it is in Ukraine's interest to find balance between the interests and to make these, division lines as blurry as possible. Although, if you ask anybody, who experienced the big split up in Yugoslavia, they will say it was palpable in the air before this happened. In Ukraine, nobody, even in Donbass, even in eastern Ukraine, nobody was speaking about this, Novorossiya or split up with Ukraine before Putin gave the signal at his press conference in April. But coming back to your question, I think we have already offered last autumn an extreme, amount of powers to these regions. Basically, I was meeting with Jesse Lintel from Team Strobach in Nationalrat early last week. And she said, asked the same question, and she said, why don't you give them the federation right and the neutrality, the autonomy? And I described what we have already given them, which is the right to distribute taxes, which is the right to choose whatever language they want in whatever venues they prefer, which is the right to trade with whoever they want. She said, well, this is the federation. This is what I mean by autonomy. And this is what we have already offered to them, and I think this is what is meant when we are speaking about constitutional changes in Ukraine to be implemented if, God willing, the peace prevails in these two provinces. They will be given the biggest rights in Europe's newest history. They will be given these rights, and if it's only about the rights of people, this problem will be solved. The problem, but if this was really about the rights of people, this conflict would stop already in autumn last year, because this was the time when these rights were already given to these regions. The big problem right now is that these two oblasts are flooded with Russian citizens. With Russian citizens who partly are, regular military, partly, and this is the biggest problem, are the volunteers who came with no other aim but to fight Ukraine, and they don't care about the rights. They want to see Novorossiya, and Novorossiya is half Ukraine, and this is the biggest problem that we are facing right now.
If we look at what happened when Debaltseve, a town, when the ceasefire was concluded, it was still some violence there. And there was a pause in the ceasefire to allow the citizens to leave the city. And it were about 850 people who had left in that village. Only 40 they were given a choice. Would you like to go to the, let's say, rebel-controlled area? Would you like to stay there? Or would you like to go to the Ukrainian government-controlled area? And the report was very clear. Out of the 800, about 750 wanted to go to the Ukrainian-controlled area, and only 40 or so choose to stay. And I think it is illustrative for, I think, the lack of support which Russia and the separatists found in eastern Ukraine and in those parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, Donbass. Of course, Crimea is a bit different, but in our assessment it was not because he had to protect the Russian speakers, because there's a much more important rationale to have Crimea, and that's the Black Sea Fleet. And that was the main reason why Russia thought it's better to take that before a new government has control over the fleet. And the rest, of course, there are issues of representation, but the issues have always been there. And they're always there in different countries as well. Many of the leading Ukrainian politicians, policymakers are speaking how do you say, dual linguistic, Russian and Ukrainian. If you listen to the Ukrainian ambassador to the OSCE, he often addresses the Russian ambassador in Russian to make sure that he is not a minority which needs to be defended in his own country.
I'm a Russian speaker to Ukrainian ambassador, so just it's not a problem.
Fortunately, we don't have much more time, so I'm going to take two questions. You, because you're okay, and the gentleman in back. Oh, okay. Sorry. And then we're going to have a closing round.
I'd like to come back to the question. The first question of this meeting, it's actually what are Ukrainians expected from EU, from United States, etc. And on behalf of Ukrainians, as I'm also Ukrainian, I would like to ask European society to provide European people about the real information, because if you look on the OSCE meetings, we hear these pro-Russian rebels, but not Russian army, Russian troops, because it's not, people, I mean society, European society, they don't see the threat for Europe. The conflict is somewhere in Ukraine, but not in Europe. You personally, do you understand the threat that this conflict can be done also this scenario in some of European countries? Because as we know, there is Serbia, there is...
Is that a question to Mr. Kamp?
No, it's exactly to Austrian politics.
Okay.
As do you see personally the threat that such conflicts can be done by Russia in the EU? Because as we know, Serbia and they also are Orthodox and they have a sympathy to Russia. So maybe Russian would like to protect Serbians from EU or something like that. Do you see this threat or not?
At the end?
Yeah, look, we can collect the last two questions maybe if you want to, or you want to answer right now?
As you want. Go
ahead, no, you answer.
Well, to make it very clear, I think I was somebody who supported very, very much in all my political life, especially in European Parliament, the enlargement process. I was rapporteur for Croatia from the beginning to the end, so enlargement was the policy of the European Union which brought a lot of stability into Europe. And we thought perhaps, it was not really very large, but it will go the same way with Ukraine. There are some people who would say, well, if you look to the Ukraine, maybe the association agreement was a bit premature. In some sense, I also said, and I also supported always the two things. First, Ukraine is a European country. Ukraine was part of the Ukraine was part of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, and that is Europe. So it has a right to join also, to demand joining the European Union, not now, but in some time. Secondly, I said, don't speak so much about Tymoshenko because we want Ukraine but that was especially on the other political side, they always spoke about her. We want Ukraine not in the hands of the Russians. And that, of course, was the strategy we had. But what we didn't see, I also didn't see, that Russia would react so strongly immediately. And that Russia, of course, Russia with Mr. Putin tries, and you're absolutely right, tries to have these kind of influences. And that is because we were not strong enough. We are strong, in population, but not strong politically enough. Because I was always fighting, for example, for the Nabucco pipeline, not because I wanted to avoid Ukraine, but I wanted to have also gas from countries outside Russia. And I was against, South Stream and other pipelines who would avoid Ukraine, but not avoid Russian gas. So this is the strategy, but now we have a different situation. Whatever was right or wrong, there's many young students who maybe want to look for some thesis they have to write. For example, what happened in Kiev when the 3 foreign ministers were there? Would it have been possible to say to the Maidan people, yes, but we need to some compromise for the moment in order to have a slow transformation of Ukraine or not? Because mistakes have been made, not intentionally, but maybe it was a rush where we could avoid the whole situation, could avoid all the deaths. It's not to explain, because we have to differentiate, there is no excuse for Russian action, no excuse. But we have to, nevertheless, have to see what kind of mistakes did we do without thinking about the consequence. But the answer is very clearly, Ukraine is a European country. Ukraine should come by time into European Union. We should and want to support Ukraine, but we have to demand from Ukraine what we demanded from all Eastern European countries, to do their job, their homework, their reform process. And whatever is done, the ambassador may say differently, it is not done in a thorough way. Understanding war makes it much more difficult than if you have peace. But nevertheless, I think we can convince our citizens to pay a lot of money, and at the end of the day, it's always a lot of money, only if we see that the money is well used in the country. And that is the issue, the message I want to give. But for me, it's absolutely sure that I have been very often in Ukraine, or relatively often in Ukraine. It's absolutely sure that this is a country which belongs to Europe, not only in general, but the European Union. And that is the way Ukraine should go, but it has to go also internally with their reforms.
Mr. Swoboda, but nobody denies that Ukraine has to do its homework. It's absolutely everybody is just for you to understand. I was participating before this event in energy community conference. Also, Ukrainian panel was there, and I was just giving the taste of what Ukraine is ready for, undergoing right now. There will be a spike in prices for utilities, for heating, because the gas is becoming more expensive, and it shouldn't be subsidized, this whole system, and so on and so forth. As a result, Ukrainian citizens will see their utility payments tripled. So basically, half of the money you would earn, you would in many cases pay for, just heating your apartment. And Ukrainian citizens, instead of going on demonstrations and, protesting against the Frau Merkel, who demands so much from us, and we want our money, and so on and so forth, Ukrainian citizens say, yes, we are going to do that. We are ready for this. It's not a shock therapy, it's something beyond shock therapy. We are ready, we will do that. So don't think that Ukrainians are somehow trying to muddle through their way to reforms.
Mr. Vavrik, you mentioned that the European Union is so much bigger than Russia. We have more citizens and so on. I, as Austrian, I studied in Moscow, and if I was talking with Russian politicians, they mentioned to me they are the biggest country in Europe. They have the highest mountains in Europe. If you mention that Russia should join the European Union, that's a pure provocation against the Russian soul. And Another anecdote. Last year I was invited by Professor Danschbeck-Gruber to a Princeton seminar about the Ukraine crisis, and he explained that he was absolutely positive if at the Sochi Olympic Games he would have provided Putin with the world stage he wanted to have. He probably would never has invaded the Crimea, or at least the whole situation would not escalate that much. I'm not such an expert, but he was absolutely positive about this psychological effect. Yesterday, Mr. Schäuble gave a speech at the Hofburg where he mentioned that 50% of the economy is psychology. I say 95% of this whole crisis is psychology. So if we just focus 5% on the sanctions, we will have an injured bear. And as you mentioned, Russia considers themselves as a bear. And most dangerous is an injured bear. So my question is, should we just focus a bit more on the psychology treatment of our Russian partners? Because at the end of the day, we will need the European Union, our Russian partners, as well as the Ukraine to create stability on European soil again.
We're all humans, and I'm sure that psychology, both on an individual level of Mr. Putin, or maybe even on a collective level of a nation, and the Russians are no exception, does play a role, okay? Now, however, I think we shouldn't overestimate itself. I think, contrary to other people who say, you know, Mr. Putin is an irrational madman, he's neither mad nor irrational, I would say he plays rather these aspects. And I think we cannot decide that, well, we will give up principles of international law, treaties, just for the sake of complying with the feelings of an individual, of a leader of its people. The question before was asked about, is there a real threat to Europe, especially to Austria? Of course, I don't think there is, to be very honest with you, and I think that's part of the problem. We don't feel really threatened. Today, Russia is not the Soviet Union of 40 years ago. It's very isolated. It doesn't have, buttressing its action, the ideological instrument that Soviet Russia had. Its only allies, it has far-right extremist parties. It used to have intellectuals, you know, of the left, etc. We saw it at the vote of the United Nations where the annexion of Crimea was condemned, that Russia is quite isolated. So there's no direct threat. However, there's something much more pernicious and dangerous, is that the abandonment of certain rules. I'll give you just one example. The annexation of Crimea in the intervention in Ukraine was a breach of the so-called Budapest Memorandum, which was a treaty where, among other powers, Russia pledged to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine in return for the Ukraine giving away the nuclear warheads. It had 1,250, if I remember the correct number, which is quite a lot, okay? And Ukraine said, okay, I'm giving this away, in return I get this guarantee. Because already back then, Ukraine is a new, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a new country, but it's a country which had, over the centuries, had many periods of non-sovereignty, okay? So other countries, other would-be nuclear powers watch with this, and I can imagine that many that are nuclear powers, whether they accept it or not, or would like to become ones, would say, well, you know, between a good treaty and a couple of nuclear warheads, I go for the nuclear warheads. That's obviously the better insurance. So this is just one example of the risks I see. So I don't see a direct threat and a risk, and I'm not willing to go to this risk just for you know, being nice to the feelings and emotions of a Russian leader, of its people, even if I have some sympathy for those emotions.
Can I add something about the emotions? If you ask an average Russian citizen, why do you miss Soviet Union so much? The answer that you will receive in many cases will be, well, we were a great country, everybody feared us. You notice that. The feeling, the desire to be feared is very essential to many, even normal citizens, not only to the leadership. So the thing is that what we see right now as a problem, the whole world being scared of Russia, Russia sees as an accomplishment. They enjoy it. So if you're saying that Russia is hurt, not so much. I mean, they are hurt to some extent, but to some extent they are really, you know, we are back. So it's a very fine line.
We at the beginning of the conflict, we heard the Russian representative in the OSCE often repeat also what was also coming out of Russia itself, the need to be respected as a country. Many around the table said, well, respect is something you earn, it's not something you force on other people. And I'm not sure among the EU leadership, but perhaps Mr. Swoboda, you have been more closer, of course, in European Parliament with that. There is no, I don't think there's a general feeling of fear as such towards Russia. I think there is a feeling of, first a feeling of unbelief. What do we hear now coming out of Moscow? It's, as I think Madam Merkel literally said, Mr. Putin lives in a very different universe. And how do we deal with such a situation? You have people traveling to Moscow trying to negotiate, and they come back and they tell me it's very difficult. If you mediate in a conflict, you know people try to hide things. But if they lie straight out in your face of what they do, and we see now a broadcast soon coming out where President Putin will say, well, you know, the thinking of having Crimea going back to the motherland happened on the night when President Yanukovych fled to Ukraine. We have to deal with that psychology, but I don't think, and I'm sure you agree, if you have a bad day as a person, let me come home and give my child, you know, it's not how we should conduct also politics. There's an issue definitely of interests and respects, and but I would not agree with your professor, who it was, who said if we had treated him with more respect, this may not have happened as such.
I'm afraid our time is up, but is there a need for any last short, very short closing arguments? Anybody?
Perhaps this round, if I can complement it, I think we should see it also, the reaction by Russia as a reaction to the success of the European Union. Because, and also of NATO. Well, NATO was enlarging, European Union was enlarging. And for a time, Russia could live with it. But then came the situation where all of a sudden Russia, in that constructed psychology, said, and where are we? As the ambassador said also for the citizen, because it's not only Putin. Putin is confirming with the propaganda citizens' feeling and the other way around. And that is, of course, our difficulty, that we have been successful, but as we wanted to extend the success also in direction of Ukraine, all of a sudden Russia reacted very differently. I think, there have been some documents, so I didn't read it concretely. I think Crimea was already planned by Russia in the drawer. Otherwise you cannot do it so quickly. In the drawer, in the sense, as was also mentioned, because of the fleet, if things go more or less with Yanukovych and so on, they were not very happy always, but goes in that direction, we don't have to interfere. If things go in the other direction, if really it's going to Europe, then we go in with the fleet, because this already is in the mind. And in the connection, and therefore I also underline these internal structures, in the connection with trying to strengthen Putin's position internally, using the whole ideology, using the Orthodox Church. In that sense, there is one line: the external action, the aggression, the internal action against its own people, against the demonstration, all is in this mind of Putin. I have to strengthen myself in empowering myself, and that, of course, will be accepted by the country. And therefore, containment is absolutely necessary. I totally agree. Especially also what was mentioned, this possibility to influence also the Balkans and so on. And therefore, we need a stronger European Union, a stronger policy, not primarily military, but economically, also concerning diversification of gas supplies. Many of these elements we need to show him the limits. We will not undo for the moment what happened in Crimea. We should never accept it legally, but at least we should give a clear signal that it was the maximum already what they did, and to find a solution parallel with the containment of dialogue, and try to find a solution where they can find a place internal. If it's still with Mr. Putin or his successor, I don't know. But in some way, I don't see a contradiction between containment on the one hand and trying to find an all-European security solution on the other hand.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you for a very interesting discussion.
Can I add
last remark?
Last remark. I mean, about NATO pushing it too far and making Russia feel unappreciated and ignored. Sorry if someone already heard this when I was debating with Russian ambassador on TV, but I think it's a valid point. He said the same thing. Russia was disrespected and so on, and I said, I told him a little story, very short. In August, there was a young boy, man from Dnipropetrovsk, eastern Ukrainian city, very strongly pro-Ukrainian, who went to this war to defend his country from Russia. And he spent like a week or two before he was killed. He was burned alive in his tank by one of the anti-tank missiles that Russia has no scruples whatsoever to supply to their own army. And then the mother found out about it, and she tried to throw herself out of the window of her apartment. She was stopped. She was filled with pumped with painkillers and sedatives, and she became very quiet. And very quietly, she went downstairs and hanged herself in a garage. And I asked the Russian ambassador, "Dear colleague, if you met this woman on her quiet way downstairs and told to her, Russia was disrespected in so many ways, and America left the agreement and the treaty so on in that year, would that matter to her?" No, nothing would matter to her. The difference between 21st and 20th century was supposed to be in the fact that there are no strategic interests or strategic kind of situations that are worth killing 6,000 people. It's not the narrative that we are allowed to be dragged in right now. So when we are, starting to speak, Russia was provoked and we should avoid now and we should make concessions, so on and so forth, this is the territory the aggressor wants you to drag in. And I think it's a wrong answer to this whole kind of situation. It's unthinkable war that is being conducted on European soil against Europe in part. And Europe should act accordingly. So for speaking so long.
I think
Okay, I will not add anything in the substance. I would just like to thank once again all the panelists. I would like to thank the moderator, and I would like to thank the audience for coming. I hope you found it interesting and mind-setting. We'll meet again maybe in 2 or 3 months, and probably the subject of our next NEOS foreign policy talks will be neutrality, whether it's a relic of the past or the way to the future. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. If you want, we can meet for another half an hour having drinks at the room next door. Thank you. Good night.